Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, this is obviously an important piece of legislation because for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the huge importance and influence now of digital services and social media, and just how much of our lives now are caught up with the digital world and with information technology and online economic activity and all of that stuff. And I suppose it would be particularly important in our thinking in regard to this is the recent events, the horrible events that we saw, where a small group of malign far-right actors sought to exploit in the most horrible way a terrible incident for their own political purposes, and the consequences were pretty terrible, to put it mildly. So I think that has highlighted in the public mind the importance of looking at these things. Obviously, there is a balance that we have to get right, and because we do want freedom of expression, we do want open and robust political debate. We want the right to disagree with each other, to put forward controversial views, to put forward dissenting and minority views that sometimes may not be terribly popular. And we've got to defend that too. But at the same time, we need to prevent people inciting hatred and violence or peddling dangerous misinformation. Now that's a tough balance to get right, and the potential for abuse of significant powers being given to regulatory authorities is something, you know, we need to think about. I mean, for example, I wouldn't trust, I don't know, Vladimir Putin with regulating digital online activity. I wouldn't trust the Israeli government with regulating online activity. In fact, they're very, very busy at the moment trying to suppress what I might consider, what many people might consider very valid and legitimate criticism, outrage at what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza at the moment. And in fact, they have moved very significantly to prevent digital communication in Gaza, to prevent the world and journalists and the press and people in Gaza actually conveying the true horror of the situation, and tried to suggest that, you know, if you in any way question the massacre, as I would see it, that Israel is conducting in Gaza, that you're somehow an apologist for terrorism, for example. So would one trust the Israeli government with regulating digital online communication? I certainly wouldn't. And I'd be very concerned that they would actually use it to simply censor all views that didn't suit their narrative or didn't legitimize their horrors. So on the one hand, we want to prevent online incitement, dangerous or blatant misinformation, or fraud that may occur online. But on the other hand, we can't always trust authorities to use the power they might have to regulate those things, to regulate in a genuinely fair and objective way. So that is a difficult balance to get right. And one thing I want to say that's kind of related to the bill, that given that a lot of the power in these areas is now controlled by a relatively small number of private, very, very wealthy corporations who control the online world, whether it's Mr. Musk or a small number of other super wealthy individuals who now control many of these online platforms and social media platforms, I think it is long over time we thought about one way of trying to balance things is to impose digital taxes on these companies that are making absolutely extraordinary profits. Why is that important? How does that help in what we're trying to do here? Because, and this relates to obviously the big debate we had about RTE, whatever difficulties we may have, rightly, with the governance issues that emerged in RTE, the big difference between a public service broadcaster is that at some level it's accountable to us, at some level, right? Theoretically at least, right? Theoretically it is accountable to us, and we can influence how it gets the balance right about information. And when you consider the funding problems, that if we didn't try and assist in maintaining the public service broadcaster, which by the way I think we absolutely should, I think it's imperative that we do, then the information sources that would be available would be essentially reduced down to these social media companies and a few media barons who, the Rupert Murdochs and the Elon Musks of this world. And I wouldn't trust them, as far as I could throw them, with giving fair and balanced information or with regulating online communication in a fair way. I mean, Mr. Musk, has nailed his colours to the mast, and they certainly wouldn't be views that I, or I suspect many people, would share. So the idea that these people control information, the flow of information for millions or possibly billions of people, or regulate what is dangerous, what is incitement, what is true, that's a real problem, whereas public service broadcasting, at least, there's some level of accountability. And when you consider the financial problems they have, to a fair degree related to the growth of these private social media corporations and digital information and digital news and so on and so forth, the two things are connected, their financial problems and the growth of this area. I think one way we need to balance it as a matter of urgency is to impose digital taxes in order to fund public service broadcasting, albeit a public service broadcasting that may need reform. Although, just again as an aside, I don't see how that reform should take the form of slashing the volume or quality of content, as may well happen, or jobs, because then actually the consumer of public service broadcasting is losing and the workers who did nothing wrong are losing. And that's, has to be real fears that that's what's going on when you hear about different areas of public service broadcasting being significantly reduced. It's like the public are being punished and the workforce are being punished for the wrongs of people at the top who, ironically enough, much of the wrongs they were doing were related to the fact that they were trying to be like the digital services area, the private sector. So I just want to put that on the record, that I think part of what needs to happen to balance out the dangers of what can happen on social media is to ensure that we continue to have the resources available to ensure that there are reliable sources of public service information, online, on television, on radio, in print, and so on. And it would be a tragedy if our only sources of information, digital or otherwise, became monopolised by a small group of very, very wealthy individuals who time and time again show that they have a very definite agenda, and it's usually quite a self-serving agenda, and very, very often, in fact invariably, a partisan agenda, where they have certain ideas of what is legitimate information that may not tally at all with any reasonable idea of what's actually objective, what's actually balanced, or the views that are shared by the majority of people, or views that are simply scientifically and empirically valid. Although, let's be honest, we're almost into the area of philosophy in terms of, you know, how do you assess what is empirically true, or what is genuinely balanced. So it is a tricky area, and one thing I would say is that insofar as we have regulatory bodies, these bodies that are being talked about in this legislation have to be genuinely accessible to the public. They have to have the resources necessary to be genuinely responsive to the public. I also think, and I'm not by any means an expert, but one of the things I learned, I didn't even know this group of people existed until some of them contacted me, were content moderators. It was interesting to hear their accounts of their job and of their treatment, because they work for some of these fantastically wealthy corporations, moderating content and looking at some of the most really shocking and awful content and having to moderate it to filter out the really sick stuff, the really dangerous stuff, the really horrible stuff. But they actually have to engage with this stuff and make decisions about it according to all sorts of criteria as to, you know, how do they judge that this is stuff that shouldn't actually be seen. But often, although employed by very, very profitable companies that we often imagine all the employees of are being paid very well and so on, but actually a lot of this is outsourced to people who aren't, suffer pretty awful conditions, are treated very, very badly, and aren't particularly well paid, and they're having to deal with stuff that some of them even report they have post-traumatic stress from. It's so awful what they're having to deal with. So I think this is an area we need to think about, because the people who have to deal with this stuff and moderate it need our support as workers to actually deal with this stuff, right, and to be treated properly. So, I mean, that's a slight aside, but critically, the statutory bodies or agencies that we are going to, and if I understand there's going to be a first and a second line of this in the legislation, they need to be properly resourced so that they are genuinely responsive to public concerns and then can be fair, genuinely fair and balanced. And we need to have a constant review going on of how they're adjudicating these things, so that on the one hand they are doing their job, but on the other hand they're not infringing on important rights to freedom of speech, the right to dissent, the right to have different views, and trying to get that balance right. Now, that is always going to be a controversial area. You know, sometimes the contrarians turn out, who are a minority, turn out to be very, very important people, where the majority consensus, where everybody is so certain that they're right about certain things, and then it turns out down the line that what was the majority consensus was actually a load of nonsense. It was actually misinformation. I mean, think about some of the sort of economic orthodoxies that absolutely dominated advice that it would have been given to people in the run-up to the Celtic Tiger collapse. Turned out a lot of it was total misinformation being peddled by very respectable sources about what was happening in the financial world. Right, so I'm just saying this is a sensitive area, and there's always the danger of abuse. So it's got to be subject to very considerable oversight and constant review in terms of ensuring the bodies that are there to regulate and to be fair to those who are, you know, trying to post legitimate stuff and to weed out the true poison, the genuine incitement, the violence and so on. And the other thing just I think is important, I mean, the ability, and I don't know how you deal with this, but I certainly think we need to think about it, the ability of people to hide behind online personas, I don't know if that's the word or whatever, you know, where we can't actually track these people down if they are inciting horrible stuff or doing horrible stuff online or engaged in vile or dangerous things, to actually track those people down. So that we know who they are, and to look at that area, because it does seem as if all sorts of people can hide behind fictional identities and multiple identities to spread particular forms of propaganda, lies, misleading information, or stuff that is violent and inciting or racist or whatever. So, yeah, it's a sensitive area. It's an important area that we have to get to the bottom of, but we need to make sure that the regulatory bodies operate in a very transparent way and are genuinely open and accessible and subject to review and oversight. And that we would have reports that are detailing what they're doing, what sort of issues are coming up, and that these are properly scrutinised by Oireachtas committees and so on, and open for the public to review and question. But I do think, and I'm not sure if it's this place for this legislation, but I think complementary to this, I go back to the point I made at the start. The question of these companies are making absolutely staggering profits. They are incredibly powerful now. Far too powerful as far as I'm concerned. I mean, in my socialist world, I'd nationalised a lot of them, right? Because I just think they're too powerful and the money they're making is extreme. But in the absence of that, let us at least impose a digital tax on their profits and use that to put it into public service broadcasting, a proper, reformed, decent public service broadcasting, but also into areas of other areas of culture and the arts, right, which are also massively underfunded. You know, I mean, I don't want to be critical of people, because we all do it, sitting looking at our phones and the addiction to the phone, and you're looking at this, that and the other. But wouldn't we all like if more people were, I don't know, going to more plays, going to more concerts, going to other forms of social interaction which weren't social media, and having the resources to make those things available and accessible to people, so people didn't have to rely on their phones for entertainment and information. So I do think we also need to think about that, because let's be honest, I think a lot of us think this stuff is a plague on our lives, that is consuming our lives. Now, you can't do anything about that, but what I do think is you can resource things that maybe are more healthy forms of human interaction and of sort of sources of information, make those things more accessible, and put the resources and funding into it. And there's a lot of money that could be made available to that if we imposed a digital services tax on these big streaming companies and on these digital and IT companies.